Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to a deep dive where we plunge into a stack of fascinating sources to unearth the essential nuggets of knowledge just for you.
And today, we're really tackling one of the big ones, aren't we? Consciousness, the mind, artificial intelligence, how it all fits together, or maybe doesn't. We're drawing a lot from a key philosopher in this whole area.
Yeah, this is more than just, abstract stuff. Getting a handle on these ideas is like getting a backstage pass to understanding. Well, yourself, really. Think of this as your shortcut to wrapping your head around things like the hard problem, whether AI could ever be conscious. If your mind literally spills out beyond your skull, and maybe why these questions just feel so incredibly difficult to answer.
Right. Our mission is basically to slice through the jargon, find those aha moments, because these concepts, they really do challenge how we normally think about things.
Definitely. So where do we start? The sources jump right in by saying consciousness isn't just one single thing, is it?
Exactly. It's a bit of an umbrella term, covers lots of different phenomena, and not all the puzzles tied to it are equally mind-bending.
Okay, so there are the so-called easy problems.
Right. And easy is maybe a bit misleading. It doesn't mean they're simple engineering problems.
No, figuring out brain circuits is obviously hard.
Totally. But they're easy in a philosophical sense because they deal with functions, things like telling things apart, integrating information, reporting what's going on inside, paying attention, controlling behavior, stuff like that.
These are things you can define by what they do.
Right.
Functionally definable.
Precisely. So if you can explain how the system performs that function the computation, the neural mechanism, you've essentially explained the phenomenon itself. Standard science is pretty well equipped for these.
Okay, that makes sense. That's the functional side. But then there's the hard problem.
Ah, yes, the hard problem. This is the real philosophical sticking point. It's not about the function, it's about the experience itself.
Why does all that complex processing actually feel like something from the inside? Why is there something it is like to be you, seeing red or feeling annoyed?
Exactly. Why subjectivity? Why this rich inner life? Explaining the function, how information gets processed and leads to behavior, just doesn't seem to touch why there's an accompanying subjective feeling. That's the famous explanatory gap.
It feels like you could describe every neuron firing when I see red,
Yeah.
but you haven't explained the redness I experience, it seems. Well, conceptually possible to have all the mechanics without the feeling.
And that's why purely physical explanations, just pointing to brain activity, seem to fall short here. For any physical process you describe, the question always comes back. Why should that process feel like anything at all? It seems like we might need an extra ingredient in our explanation.
Something fundamental, perhaps.
One major approach discussed in the sources, yeah. Treat conscious experience not as something that emerges from or reduces to physics, but as something fundamental itself. Like, mass or spin or charge are fundamental in physics.
So you stop trying to build consciousness out of just physical stuff, and instead look for the basic rules connecting the physical stuff to experience.
Exactly. The search shifts to finding fundamental psychophysical principles, or laws. Laws that bridge that gap, that tell us how specific physical processes give rise to specific kinds of experiences.
And the data for that kind of science would have to include our own experiences, right? First-person stuff.
Absolutely crucial. You can't build a science of experience without looking at experience. So first-person data introspection, subjective reports becomes essential, even with all the known difficulties of relying on introspection. It's distinctive data you wouldn't get just from looking at brain scans or behavior.
Okay, that framework makes sense. It sets up the challenge. Now, the sources get into some specific proposed principles within that approach. Structural coherence.
Right. This suggests there's a tight link, a systematic relationship between the structure of your conscious experience, like the way colors seem related, or the spatial layout of your visual field, and the functional structure of what's called awareness.
And awareness here means the information that's like globally available in the system. Stuff you can report or use to guide your actions.
That's the idea. Information poised for widespread use. Structural coherence says the structure of your subjective experience mirrors, or is isomorphic to, the structure of that functionally defined awareness. It might not be logically necessary you could imagine the function without the feeling, but it seems to be a strong constraint on how our minds actually work.
So if you understand the structure of the information processing, the awareness part,
you can potentially explain the structure of the experience part via this coherence principle. It suggests maybe the most direct physical correlate of consciousness is actually that informational structure of awareness itself.
Interesting. Structure matches structure. Okay, what about the next one? This sounds really relevant today. Organizational invariance.
Oh, this one is huge. And definitely debated. It's the idea that consciousness depends on the abstract pattern of causal interactions, the functional organization.
And not on the specific stuff it's made of, like
Right.
neurons versus silicon chips.
Exactly. Substrate independence. The thought experiment often used is like, what if you gradually replaced each neuron in your brain with a silicon chip that performed the exact same function in the network? If organizational invariance holds, your conscious experience shouldn't change because the functional organization remains the same.
Wow. So it's the software, not the hardware, that matters for consciousness.
That's the analogy, yeah. It shifts the whole focus from biology to computation or information patterns. It's a very powerful idea.
Okay, and there's a third one mentioned, more speculative.
The double aspect theory of information. This is a deeper, more metaphysical proposal trying to bridge the explanatory gap fundamentally. It suggests that information itself, in the sense of distinctions and relations within an information space, inherently has two aspects.
A physical aspect and a phenomenal aspect.
Cool.
Right. Two sides of the same coin. Experience, on this view, is the intrinsic, phenomenal nature of physically realized information. It's not something added to the physical. It's what the physical is from the inside when organized as information. Very speculative, but trying to find that fundamental link.
Let's circle back to organizational variance then, because it ties directly into AI. If consciousness really just depends on the organizational pattern.
Then yes, it opens the theoretical door to conscious AI. If a silicon-based system, or any system really, could instantiate the right functional organization, whatever that turns out to be according to those psychophysical principles we're looking for, then according to this principle, it could be conscious.
So the question isn't, can silicon feel, but can silicon run the consciousness program, metaphorically speaking?
Pretty much. The focus shifts to identifying that necessary functional structure. And this is a really crucial distinction the sources make, just building an AI that acts conscious or says it's conscious.
Like current large language models might seem to do sometimes.
Right. That doesn't automatically mean it has genuine subjective experience, according to this view. That kind of behavior might relate to the easy problems, or maybe this meta problem we'll get to later, but it doesn't guarantee the inner what it's like part.
Okay, that's a vital distinction. Now, shifting gears slightly, but still thinking about boundaries, let's talk about the extended mind. This also pushes our intuitions, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. This challenges the common sense idea that your mind starts at your skin or skull. The extended mind thesis argues that parts of the external world can sometimes literally become part of your cognitive processes.
Like the classic example of Otto and his notebook, where the notebook acts like his memory.
Exactly. Or think about playing Tetris. The way you physically rotate the blocks on screen isn't just you using a tool. The interaction is part of the thinking process of figuring out where the block goes.
So the key is this active, ongoing coupling. Perception and action linking you to the external thing.
Yes, that sensory-motor loop is critical. The external element plays a dynamic role in driving the cognitive process forward. But here's where the sources draw a careful line, while endorsing the extended mind.
They're skeptical about extending consciousness in the same way, through those loops.
Right, there's skepticism there. The argument hinges on the idea that consciousness might require a more direct kind of access to information for global control within the system. Information you get by, say, looking something up in your notebook is only indirectly available compared to information already buzzing around inside your brain.
Now think about it. Your belief about the address might extend to the notebook, part of your extended cognition. But the actual conscious experience, the feeling of remembering it, might require the information to be available differently, maybe not through that external perception action cycle.
That's the suggestion. It raises this fascinating possibility that your intentional states, your cognitive processes, could literally spread out into the world while your conscious experience remains more tightly bound to your biological brain. Cognition and consciousness could potentially come apart spatially.
The sources mentioned the Diva case too, replacing a brain part with a chip. How does that fit?
Yeah, that's presented as extended cognition, but it's different because the integration is via direct wiring, not perception and action like Otto's notebook. So even people who are skeptical about the Otto-style extended mind might accept the Diva case as extended cognition, but crucially, it doesn't rely on that perception-action link, which is where the skepticism about extending consciousness is focused. That boundary seems really important.
Okay, let's try and grasp this functionalist approach using another analogy. The sources bring up how science treats things like color and space.
Yeah, this is a really helpful way to think about it. Take color. In our everyday experience, the manifest image color seems like a property of objects. The apple is red.
Seems obvious, right?
But science, the scientific image, explains color differently. It talks about surface reflectances, wavelengths of light, processing in our eyes and brain. The subjective feeling of red isn't out there on the apple, it's generated in our minds. The problem of what red feels like becomes part of the hard problem of consciousness.
And functionalism about color says we define red not by some intrinsic quality, but by its role, like what typically causes red experiences or allows us to pick out red things.
Exactly. You move from thinking color is a primitive property of the world, color primitivism, to defining it by the job it does, color functionalism. Now, apply that same pattern to space.
Okay, so spatial functionalism. Instead of assuming space is this fundamental pre-existing container with inherent spatialness.
This Edenic space, as it's sometimes called.
Right. Instead, we define space by the role it plays.
Yes. Identify space with whatever structure does the job of space. And that job, that space role, can be defined functionally. Maybe based on how it causes spatial experiences, things feeling near or far, looking arranged in certain ways.
Or based on its role in physics, like having 3 dimensions, defining distances, allowing things to move continuously, ensuring interactions are local.
Exactly. Its structural properties, its role in physical dynamics. This becomes super relevant for things like quantum gravity theories, where space-time itself might not be fundamental. It might emerge from some deeper, non-spatio-temporal reality.
Which sounds like it creates a hard problem of space-time, right? How do you get the feeling of space from something non-spatial?
Precisely. And spatial functionalism offers a potential answer, mirroring the color case. It says, maybe those fundamental Edenic spatial qualities we feel aren't properties of the fundamental physical world either.
They're in the mind, part of the hard problem of consciousness again.
That's the move. Those subjective spatial qualities are generated by our minds. The physical world, fundamentally, might only have the structure that plays the space role, the functional small space. So a theory of quantum gravity only needs to recover that functional structure, not the primitive Edenic feel.
So even if we were in the matrix, functionally speaking, the space we interact with could still be considered real space under this view.
The sources suggest, yes, functionally it is. It plays the space role. It's just another step where something we thought was a fundamental feature of reality, like Edenic space, gets reinterpreted functionally, and the raw feel gets located within consciousness.
Okay, this functionalist move is powerful. Now, we have the hard problem itself, but the sources introduce this other, really distinct question. The meta-problem of consciousness.
Right. This flips the script. It's not asking what is consciousness or why does physics give rise to it. It's asking why do we humans find consciousness so damn puzzling?
Why do we have these strong intuitions that it's weird, mysterious, maybe non-physical, and just incredibly hard to explain?
Exactly. The data for the meta problem isn't the feeling of red itself. It's our reports about the feeling of red being hard to explain. It's our judgments, our intuitions, like the feeling of an explanatory gap or the sense that consciousness is somehow fundamental.
And the goal is to explain those reports and intuitions functionally, using cognitive science.
Yes. Find the mechanisms in our own cognitive architecture, our introspection, our self-models that cause us to think and say that consciousness is such a hard problem, regardless of whether it actually is in some ultimate sense.
Whoa, so the very sense of mystery might be like a feature of our own mental software.
That's the kind of explanation being sought. Maybe it's because we can't introspectively access the physical workings of our own minds, introspective opacity, so our cognitive system just represents these states as having these irreducible primitive qualities, like the primitive quality attribution idea, just as vision paints the world with color qualities, introspection might paint our mental states with phenomenal qualities.
Could solving the meta problem, figuring out why we think it's hard, actually help with the hard problem itself?
That's the hope for some, especially for, say, illusionists about consciousness. If you could fully explain why we have the strong intuition of a hard problem, maybe that dissolves the problem itself, showing it was based on confused intuitions generated by our cognitive quirks.
But there's a catch, the resistance problem.
Yeah, people seem much more resistant to being told their feeling of pain is just an illusion generated by their cognitive architecture than they are to being told that the redness out there on the apple is an illusion created by their visual system. Why that deep resistance, that resistance itself becomes part of the meta problem that needs explaining.
So the meta problem is about the psychology of the puzzle. while the hard problem is about the nature of experience.
Mm.
And the meta problem seems more, well, scientifically approachable.
Definitely seems more tractable. You can use standard cognitive science, AI modeling, philosophical analysis to study problem reports, model introspective mechanisms, test hypotheses about why we generate these specific kinds of intuitions. It's a more grounded research program in many ways.
Wow. Okay, we have really covered a lot of ground here. Let's try to pull some threads together. We started with that fundamental split, the easy problems of function versus the really hard problem of subjective experience, that nagging explanatory gap.
And we looked at ways philosophers trying to tackle that gap, maybe taking experience as fundamental, searching for new psychophysical principles, guided by ideas like structural coherence, the very provocative organizational invariance.
And that deeper double aspect theory of information.
Right. Then we saw how organizational invariance, if true, is what gives theoretical weight to the possibility of AI consciousness. It's about the pattern, not the substrate. But, crucially, distinguishing that possibility from just building machines that act conscious.
We also push the boundaries of the mind itself with the extended mind thesis cognition, spilling into tools like notebooks or Tetris blocks, but then hitting that point of skepticism about whether conscious experience extends in the same way via perception action loops.
Yeah, that direct access idea seems key there. And we use that great analogy with functionalism about color and space, showing how philosophical analysis can reinterpret problems, suggesting maybe even the hard problems of space or color ultimately point back to the hard problem of consciousness within us.
And finally, that inward turn, the meta problem. Not just asking what consciousness is, but why we find it so baffling, looking for cognitive explanations for our own philosophical intuitions, which might, in turn, shed light on the original puzzle.
It makes it clear these aren't questions with easy answers waiting just around the corner.
Yeah.
As the sources suggest, philosophical progress here might look different from science. Maybe less about universal agreement and more about refining ideas, mapping the problem space, ruling out dead ends, or maybe even recognizing we need new conceptual tools or enhanced ways of thinking.
So what does all this mean for you, listening right now?
Well, it definitely shows that the boundaries we intuitively draw, mind and world, brain and tool, self and environment, are way more blurred and complex than they first appear. And it highlights something quite profound, that our most deeply felt intuitions about reality, about our own minds, about what's mysterious, might actually stem from the architecture of our own thinking machines. Philosophical inquiry becomes partly an inquiry into ourselves.
Which leaves us with a pretty big question to ponder, doesn't it? If understanding consciousness requires taking subjective experience as fundamental, or if the puzzle lies partly in the structure of our own minds, what does that tell us about the limits of science as we currently practice it? And could it be that unlocking these deepest mysteries will require not just better theories, but maybe fundamentally changing or augmenting our own cognitive abilities?
Something to think about.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mind's biggest mysteries.